Hey guys, I thought this week we'd actually discuss our final projects, but instead we were asked to discuss size and scale of political order. And we've actually learned about some of the political theorists. Chief among them was Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan. And in it, he actually discusses uh, the proper size of a government. And to me, when I hear Thomas Hobbes, I think big government. And what I mean by big government is uh, how much control the government has in society. For example, how what what kind of level of taxation, uh, what kind of social programs they're implementing. Is there free health care? Do they control the economy or not? Uh, to me, that's what I mean by big government. And also, when we think about Thomas Hobbes, we think about the state of nature and also the social contract. And there's actually three political theorists on social contract and uh, state of nature. For like Hobbes, he argued that state of nature was actually very violent and life was short. And an example a professor gave was uh, like someone collecting acorns as food, although I probably wouldn't recommend eating acorns, but uh, I digress. Uh, what he said, which I still remember to this day, is let's say I'm living in the forest and I see a guy collecting acorns and he has, abundance of acorns. And I myself, I have no food. Like I live in a resource poor area. And so I see this guy has a lot of acorns. And of course, being the state of nature as it is, I go and I dent the guy's skull and I take his acorns. Whereas John Locke disagrees. He actually says that people are good and people will actually cooperate. And so I see the guy has, abundance of acorns. I don't. I go and I tell him, I'm hungry. Can you spare some acorns? And the guy, of course, will give me the acorns. Rousseau, on the other hand, he was kind of in between. I think he actually argued that people will cooperate when they can. Otherwise, they will use force to gain what they need. And so basically with the state of nature being as it is, people get tired of it and they form a government by actually uh, giving up some of their liberty so that they can set up this government that actually will, you know not necessarily dictate to them, but the whole idea is that they actually protect these people. And that's the whole idea of government. And we also talked about size of country. For example, maybe some people might argue that we might be too big because we've learned that the size of a republic should be small. And a medium-sized republic would be about the size of Switzerland or possibly Belgium or the Netherlands. Something about half the size of the state of South Carolina, or maybe in South Carolina itself. Around that size would be the best for a republic. And an example was Rome. Rome was a republic. It started out as a republic, and as it grew in size territorially, it got too big and it collapsed into what we'd call an empire. And because, after all, they ruled most of the territory around the Mediterranean Sea. And so that begs the question, is the United States considered an empire? Because we're a huge continent. We have territory that occupies on either end of two oceans, and so that begs the question. And so, in discussing empires, uh, I would probably actually talk about Russia because Russia is a didn't really start out as a republic of any sort. It actually was more of a principality or a kingdom when it started out. and as it grew in size, it became an empire. And the Russians really didn't use force. Well, obviously they used force when they conquered the territory, but as far as maintaining their empire, they used relatively little force as far as controlling the empire. I mean, yes, you'd use force to take down dissidents and rebellions and stuff like that. But what they did, rather than using force, they used what was called deference. And what I mean by difference is what they did is they actually allowed the conquered nation to maintain their customs, maintain their language, and their religion. They might have encouraged, you know, for them to learn Russian because, well, after all, they're now part of the Russian Empire. So, to be able to communicate effectively with each other, obviously they probably would encourage Russian, but it was not forced upon them. Nor was Russian Orthodoxy forced upon them as well. So if you were Muslim, you were still able to retain your religion. You were still able to practice it. And for big government, I actually looked at political ideology that really is big government if you think about it, and that was fascism. And people are is don't generally understand what fascism is. Uh, they automatically assume far right. Oh, fascist is a right wing ideology. No, actually, fascism is a left wing ideology. Uh, and that's when people get confused. It's like, well, everyone agrees that it's right wing. No, it's actually left wing. Uh, as far as like what Americans consider left wing and right wing, uh, right wing is conservative, left wing is progressive or liberal. Although fascism isn't liberal, it's actually a progressive uh, party. And in Europe, what they mean by right wing and left wing is what side of the parliament that you actually sat on. So, for example, the fascists sat on the right wing of the parliament, and that's where you get the right wing type label. Whereas the socialists and the communists, they were on the left wing of the parliament. Um, and in fascism, uh, the individual was a cog in the machine. Basically, your sole purpose in life is is you whatever you do, it has to be something for the state. Uh, that's the main thing. The main thing is the state or the collective. And I also read an article on the philosophy of the New Deal, in which the writer uh, W.J. Shepard argued that the New Deal was uh, a whole new type of ideology or philosophy, if you want to call it that. It was neither left wing, it was neither right wing, it was something totally different. Although what he writes about the New Deal, he discusses like the right for adequate standard of living, the right to maintenance of health, in other words, health care, uh, the right to education, uh, and the right to certain leisure activities, uh, and the right to security, and like unemployment, uh, and other things. And really, to tell you the truth, uh, this actually is sort of similar to uh, the fascist, especially when we talk about Germany. It's very similar. If you just threw in uh, ocean cruises and the people's car, that would be exactly the same thing that Adolf Hitler tried to do in Germany in the 1930s. Exact same platform. Uh, people's car was Volkswagen. That's where the origins of Volkswagen came from, and people were allowed so many weeks, I believe, of vacation, and they encouraged them to take ocean cruises, which I believe was actually paid for by the government. Uh, so the New Deal was actually something similar to what the fascists were doing, and you'd almost actually have to argue that it was actually fascist. Uh, but I suppose I probably raised more questions than I answered. Uh, but I do wish you guys luck on your final papers and also your video posts as well. Thank you for listening.